to our third Indigenous Science seminar series featuring Dan Steele, and Allison's going to introduce him.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to welcome Dan Steele to give this seminar. Dan's working with us on the reflection group component of the Indigenous Science Project, and is a crucial part of it because, in part, because of the work he's doing now on diversity in science. He's going to be presenting work that he's been developing in the context of a SSHRC-funded grant, the title of which is Distinct Concepts of Diversity, Ethical and Epistemic Implications for Science. By way of background, Dan did his doctoral work in the History Philosophy of Science program at Pittsburgh, which is the premier HPS program in the world. Worked on mechanisms, has done quite technical, interesting work in philosophy of science, including a terrific paper on carbon-14 dating and the role of Bayesian statistics in carbon-14 dating. He opens the hood and looks at the details of how Bayesian statistics are used. But in this context, when he finished at Pitt, he moved immediately to a job at Michigan State University, which as a philosophy department is really distinctive in having a critical mass of people, a remarkable density of people who work on what gets called generically values in science, and has increasingly worked in that intellectual space, very interdisciplinary, but also grounded in detailed knowledge of the science. He recently published, 2015, a book entitled Philosophy and the Precautionary Principle, which takes him directly into engagement with research ethics issues and work on deliberation about science and in science policy. At UBC, you moved here, I think, 5 years ago?
2015. So.
Oh, the same year as the book, okay. So more recently than I realized, 3 years ago, where he is in the Maurice Young Centre for Applied Ethics, affiliated with philosophy, but teaches regularly in the context of public health and democracy.
Yeah, so the center's in the ethics is in the School of Population and Public Health.
So anyway, good fortune for us that UBC managed to capture Dan and move him here, and that he's engaged with our project. His talk today, Diversity and Its Effects on Group Performance in Science, is one component of this broader SSHRC-funded project.
Okay, well, I was going to say I'm very happy to be here and to be a part of this group. Some things are not showing up, but anyway, this was just a obligatory slide thanks to SSHRC and to the team members. For some reason, not everything is showing up here, so I'm just going to begin just saying a few words about the project and get a sense of where what I'm going to talk about today and how it fits in. So this project is really motivated by the idea that people can mean different things by diversity when they talk about diversity. And there's sort of an obvious and a less obvious sense in which that's true. The obvious sense is that when you talk about diversity, you can talk about gender diversity, ethnic diversity, educational diversity, diversity in incomes, diversities in lots of different kinds of ways. And that's obvious that there are all these different attributes or characteristics that you might be interested in when you're talking about diversity, and that diversity in one of these attribute categories might not necessarily have the same effects as diversity in another one. So, for example, disciplinary diversity and gender diversity might have different effects. The less obvious thing is that even if you stay with a fixed attribute, like gender or social class, income, what have you, that the concept of diversity can still vary even with a fixed concept. And this is something that in the literature on diversity in science, as far as I know, people don't really seem to be aware of as much at all. There's some discussion of this in social science, mainly about when people talk about measures of diversity with sort of mathematical formulas to measure how diverse a group is, and then there's some discussion this comes up. Actually, in biodiversity, there's a big discussion about this, and there seems to be quite a bit of awareness that there are different concepts of biodiversity. But when people are talking about diversity among scientists, this doesn't come up so much. So I'm going to give you an example. This is an example that I might have mentioned to some of you before, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself. But this is an example that how I what it's inspired me to start thinking about this. And in some ways, it's sort of a quintessential Vancouver example, because it came from taking my kids to Chinese school and getting stuck in a traffic jam because there was a Vaisakhi parade, which is a parade for that happens in April for the Sikh community. And it's a really big deal in Metro Vancouver. If you've ever been to the Surrey one, I think this in 2018 it was like 500,000 people attended it. So these parades are held annually in Vancouver and Surrey, and when I went sort of by accident, taking my kids to Chinese school, my two boys ran into Chinese school. My daughter wanted to see what all this fuss was about, so I took her. And it was shortly after Trudeau had been elected, and there was someone on the stage talking, "We're so happy we have a new prime minister who really cares about diversity." And I was like, "Diversity? Yeah, he's really diverse." So I brought my daughter back to Chinese school, tried to cookie for half an hour, and I think, okay, is it diverse, right? Like, well, yeah, because the majority of people here aren't Christian, right? So it's really diverse, but there's a sense in which it's not diverse, because even if you're thinking of religion and religious affiliation as a relevant attribute, well, almost everybody's a Sikh, they're almost all the same religion, so that's not diverse. And then once you start thinking along these lines, you start to realize there's more and more ways you can think of they're diverse and not diverse. Let me just give you one more. Yes, they are diverse, because in fact, I don't know if this is actually true, but it's true that the major sects of Sikhism are proportionately represented in comparison to, say, the Sikh diaspora in North America. Okay. So what these three answers illustrate is that there are different ways you can think about what diversity means, even if the attribute, in this case, say religious affiliation, is held constant. So here are three diversity concepts that you kind of abstract from these answers. One is this notion of egalitarian diversity. Diversity just means you have a set of attribute categories that say different religious affiliations. Well, they're diverse if you basically got a uniform distribution, equal numbers in each group. And that's sort of the answer that's behind the idea of diversity that's behind this. The second answer that says it's not diverse because, look, almost everybody's in one group. Diversity would mean you've got equal numbers of Christians, Muslims, Hindus, etc., Sikhs, and that's not what you've got. You got almost everybody in one group, and that's sort of, for this way of thinking about diversity, sort of the minimum, the opposite of diversity. But there's other ways you can think about diversity. Like the first answer that says, yeah, it's really a diverse event, is really motivated by this concept. And this is a concept, I think, that people use intuitively a lot. The first one, I think, is by far the most common when people do research on diversity. But the second one is really common in ordinary talk. And you can actually find it, people falling into this mode of thinking about diversity even in research oftentimes without quite being aware of it. So on this, what I call normative conception of diversity, the idea is that to say a group is diverse implies comparison with some reference population in which there's a non-diverse norm. For simplicity, you can think of this non-diverse norm as sort of a single category. I think in most cases usually it's a cluster of categories, but for simplicity, just think of one category. And say in the example above, if the reference population is Canada, then the non-diverse norm, the non-diverse category might be Christian if we're talking about religious affiliation. Okay. So given that conception, a group is diverse just in case, to the extent its members are not whatever the non-diverse norm is. So in this case, it's like, okay, almost nobody's Christian, right? The vast majority are not Christian, this is diverse. And just to back up a second. And one thing that often gives away this kind of way of thinking about diversity, when people say diverse person or diverse people, this is almost a giveaway that somebody's thinking about diversity in this way. Because notice, diverse person makes absolutely no sense if this is what you think diversity means. A single person cannot be diverse. I encourage you after Google, can a single person be diverse? You find people debating this exact thing without realizing this is what they're arguing about, that they've got these two different things. Interestingly, you find more interesting debates about this on just like Googling on the internet than you find in the academic literature, which is kind of interesting. So representative diversity is another way to think about diversity. And this is kind of the third answer where it said, well, they're diverse because the distribution of the sex is proportional to what's in the Sikh diaspora in North America. Here, diversity means the distribution in this focal group that you're interested in matches a distribution in some reference population. So if you, in the Vaisakhi example, if you said this people in this group are diverse, well, why is that? Because their distribution matches this other population. So this is something again that comes up quite a lot in debates about diversity in science, for example, you'll find people talking about, well, this academic department is diverse. Why? Because its distribution matches the recent PhD distribution in this field, for example. And notice again, both of these two concepts involve comparison with the reference population, whereas this one doesn't. So that's an interesting difference. So the key insight behind this wasn't just that there are different concepts, but that in addition there are different explanations associated with these concepts. And what I'm going to talk about today is really focused on the second part about what some of these different explanations are. So for example, if you think about this kind of explanation, why is diversity in this egalitarian sense good? Well, when you think about epistemic explanations, explanations having to do with knowledge, the reason almost always is something like, if you have greater diversity, you'll have a greater breadth of ideas about how to solve the problem or complete the task you're supposed to do. So diversity, let's say in demographic terms or in whatever kind of terms you're interested in, leads to diversity of ideas, of knowledge, experiences, and that's very often the kind of explanation we'll get with the egalitarian concept of diversity. Normative concepts of diversity are often associated with explanations, but different explanations. These ones tend to be associated with explanations that focus on social justice and on oppression, and often are motivated by the idea that people who are on the receiving ends of oppression will often have insights that people who are more privileged parts of society won't have. And so standpoint epistemology is a common example of that kind of thing. And representative, and the obvious motivation for that is something like democratic legitimacy, but there can also be epistemic motivations for this too. For instance, in debates about climate change and how it's represented in the media, you've probably all heard the arguments or criticisms of the media for sort of doing this sort of here's the climate denier, here's the climate scientist, sort of equal time to both viewpoints or something. Arguing, well, that doesn't give a representative picture of the scientific opinion, and that matters because that scientific opinion is sort of driven by the evidence of the data. The idea would be so you're giving people a misleading impression of what the evidence is in this case. So that would be a sort of epistemic argument for representative diversity. So the point is that these different concepts, they have different rationales and reasons for them, and that really matters for thinking about diversity. But what I'm going to talk about today is the part about the explanations. And here I'm going to talk about sort of empirical explanations, explanations about how diversity affects group performance that have been sort of studied empirically. And as background for that, it's important to sort of give a sense of what the literature is like. And since I'm going to be talking about what we're interested here is particularly about science, but I'm going to be talking about a lot of research that's not from science. It's important to explain why I'm doing that. And the reason for that is very simply that if you looked at all of the sort of literature on diversity and how it affects group performance, the part of that literature that's on groups that are sort of not scientific teams or not scientific research groups is far and away larger than the small sort of subset that's specifically about science. And so if you were just to talk about this, there might be like a handful of papers to talk about, and you couldn't get a whole heck of a lot out of it. So I'm going to talk about this whole circle, not just this little intersection. And that a lot of this is from business management and other places like that. All right. So one of the things about empirical literature on diversity and how it affects group performance is that this literature is really varied. And in fact, if you wanted to cherry pick results, you probably could find a study for almost any conclusion you wanted to support. So it's a literature that's really difficult to notoriously difficult to get a sort of handle on what it means. So I think it's very important to begin with some sense of different ways you can kind of divide up the kinds of explanations and approaches that people take to sort of have a sort of mental map that helps sort of organize things. And in our project, we developed a particular way of doing this that's different than the way other people have done it. So what I'm going to do is begin by explaining a way of dividing it that's somewhat influential in the field, and explain why we're not doing that and what we're doing instead. So here's a division that's proposed in a chapter from 1995 by Graff and colleagues. It divides sort of diversity explanations of how diversity affects group performance in three different types. The first type is what they call trait explanations, and these are ones in which diversity in one trait affects diversity in another trait, where that second trait is sort of more closely related to whatever the task is, and then that has an impact on how well the group does. So the standard example would be, say, demographic diversity increases diversity about experiences or knowledge or information, and that in turn produces more creativity or more innovative results. There can be other types of trait explanations, as we'll see, but that's probably the most common kind. Expectation explanations are different. They suggest that even if who you are, as it were, isn't related to what you know, that just seeing diversity in a group can change people's expectations about what people in the group know, even if, in fact, there really is no connection between these things. And that can change group dynamics in ways that can actually be beneficial. And then power differentials, the demographic differences can be related to power differentials. Now, we don't adopt this approach for a few reasons. One is that the most common approach, prominent explanatory approach that you find in literature doesn't really correspond precisely to any of these three options, number one. Number two, power differential approaches I think is problematic to treat as a sort of separate category unto itself. And I think it makes more sense just to view this as something that can be involved and often typically is involved in any of the other explanations rather than just some sort of separate explanation. So here's the way we propose to do it, to divide these explanations between the double-edged sword, which we claim is just by far and away the most common sort of explanatory framework you find in this literature. And here the idea of the double-edged sword is that diversity has positive effects by increasing the sort of breadth of knowledge present in the group, but it also has negative effects on group cohesion. That's the double-edged sword. The second, or the contrasting group from that, is what we call diversity can benefit information elaboration. That's just an acronym for that. And here the idea is that not so much to say that this is wrong, but to say that it leaves out something important, and namely it leaves out the idea that in addition to who you are can affect what you know, as in explanations like this, the presence of diversity can affect information elaboration. And information elaboration is the process by which information or ideas, knowledge in the group is sort of brought out. And even if there's no connection between task-relevant knowledge and diversity, say demographics or other things, it can affect the dynamics through which the information is processed in ways that are positive. Right? And we'll look at some of those explanations. Okay, so with that, let's move on to double-edged sword. This is a classic statement of this from 1996. And it says, on the one hand, some research suggests that more diverse groups have the potential to consider a greater range of perspectives and to generate more high-quality solutions than less diverse groups. On the other hand, the greater the amount of diversity in a group or an organizational subunit, the less integrated the group is likely to be, and the higher the level of dissatisfaction and turnover. Diversity thus appears to be a double-edged sword, increasing the opportunity for creativity as well as increasing the likelihood that group members will be dissatisfied and fail to identify with the group. Okay. So, classic statement of the double-edged sword: diversity has positive effects on group performance by increasing the breadth of ideas, but also tends to increase or decrease cohesion, so people don't get along as well. This is the second statement, and this one is a more recent one. And this one has some features that are lacking in that first statement that are very common in pretty much almost all statements that follow that. And those features are, one, dividing attributes that are relevant to diversity into sort of two different kinds. One that has more to do with demographics or social identity, one that is more sort of about task-relevant knowledge, and arguing that the negative effects from diversity are really from the first kind, the identity demographic kind of diversity, and that to the extent that demographic diversity or identity diversity has positive effects, it does so by impacting the sort of diversity in knowledge. So I'll just read this. The claim that perspectives and heuristics may be influenced by race, geography, gender, or age as much as recommended. Okay, here's the idea that there's considering the possibility. Okay, yeah, it can happen that demographic diversity or identity diversity can affect sort of task-relevant knowledge. Preferences. However, we're even applying our results. So this is a paper that has a sort of agent-based model of how diversity can, how diversity can produce positive effects. even when we're applying our results to those cases when identity diversity has been shown to correlate with functional diversity, we need to be acutely aware that identity diverse groups have more conflict, more problems with communication, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So again, the not task relevant knowledge, or what we call here the cognitive diversity, sort of mediates between demographic diversity and improved group performance, and the bad effects are due to the identity diversity. So put that in the picture, double-edged sword, DAG, directed acyclic graph, is that a phrase? Anyway, so DAG is just so the idea is you've got demographic diversity, so increases task related diversity, increases performance. That's sort of the positive edge of the double-edged sword. And on the negative edge, you've got this. So if you look at this for a second, think about what does this picture entail. Notice that it doesn't actually entail that these two things are positively associated, because that's all going to depend. It's going to depend on how strong this relation is in comparison to how strong this path is. It could be positive or negative, or conceivably zero, right? Conceivably, similarly the same thing over here. This could be positively or negatively associated with this. This is all going to depend on how strong these different relationships are. But what it does predict is that this one's going to be more positively associated with this than this one is. And that just follows from the assumption, which is pretty obvious and hard to argue with, that these two things aren't sort of perfectly correlated with one another. There might be some correlation between these two things, but it's obviously quite a bit of variance. This will not determine that. So that means that the relationship on this positive line between this one and this one is going to be more attenuated than for this one. And similarly, the negative path is going to be more attenuated between this and this, between this and this. Okay, and that's something I'm going to call the conventional wisdom, because this is a sort of basic piece of result that tends to come out in a lot of meta-analyses that this is supposed to explain. So let me just give you an example of that kind of result from the team science literature. So this is from a study from 2015, and it's in this field of oncofertility, which I have to admit I didn't know existed before I read about it in this paper. So in this study, the outcome is counts of publications, and they find that this, and that's how they measure innovation, is positively associated with knowledge diversity, so background diversity and sort of knowledge of the team members, but it's not associated with gender diversity and negatively associated with international diversity. So, and then they suggest the sort of classic double-edged sword to counter these results. So here, notice this is clearly going to be task-related diversity. These are more sort of demographic diversity. This is more positively associated with the performance of these two things, right? So this is a classic example of.
Just ask a quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Just because I've learned from the Board of Governors the way innovation is used, it can be highly restrictive.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just tell me what innovation is being meant there?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. It's measured in a lot of different ways. This is a slightly unusual way to measure it as, and they just measure it as count of publications.
So that, okay.
Why they want to call that innovation is a little unclear. There's other studies who measure it by, there's a number of bibliometric ways of measuring that outcome. Another way to do it is you look at references, and basically you ask, are they citing references that normally aren't cited together? And then that's sometimes used in the measure of innovation. So yeah, I mean, you might view this as much of impact or just, since in fact what they were measuring was publication counts, I mean, that's what it's measuring.
So in this case, that means publication counts.
Yeah, that's what they meant in this study.
Which could basically just be Kuhnian normal science.
Exactly, yeah. So it's a little unclear why that should be called innovation. And I think that's, how to measure something like innovation is obviously a very challenging thing.
Well, for reference, the Board of Governors at UBC measures it in the commercialization of research results.
So in fact, the Kuhnian normal science point is a good one, because that weights the whole, skews the whole thing toward fact, that what you're going to favor, if the Kuhnian account is right, you're going to favor homogeneous working groups, non-diverse working groups, because they're more likely to get product out, right? Is that a fair critique?
I'm not sure. I don't. Well, okay. So this is taking. So I'll get to different biases are associated with different ways of measuring performance a bit later. So I'm going to get to some of those issues. There are other studies that find more positive associations between, for example, gender diversity or ethnic diversity and some bibliometric measure of scientific impact. Interestingly, those typically aren't ones that measure publication count. Those usually measure citations. And so that's one thing about. There's different biases associated with different ways of measuring that. And that actually turns out to be a really important issue. Okay, so let's just look at some meta-analyses. I have references for all these. I didn't put them on the slide because it would be too long. So if you look at meta-analyses, and again, the meta-analyses, that's all the ones I know of, are not from Science or Team Science. They're all just from sort of general diversity impacts literature. So the majority of those are going to be in business or management fields. So typically what they find is a small but positive association between task-related diversity and performance. And typically find no statistically significant association or slightly negative association between demographic diversity and group performance. That bullet. Okay. So there are exceptions to these, but this is sort of the overall most common pattern again. So that's exactly the thing that the double-edged sword is supposed to predict, and of course that's not an accident. I mean, the double-edged sword is pretty much designed to explain these kinds of findings. Okay. So I'll just call that the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom is this thing that's predicted by the double-edged sword, and of course the double-edged sword explains that. So not everybody believes believes this conventional wisdom. We'll get back in a second. But in addition, given that there's quite a bit of variance in these results, there's quite a lot of work on effect modifiers. And these effect modifiers, I think, are actually, for this group, are actually really interesting because there are things to consider when we're thinking about how this group operates and how successful it might be, and things that might make it more or less successful. So, given that there's quite a lot of variance in the results, there's been quite a lot of research in this field on effect modifiers. And so one of those is the demographic distribution. Here the idea is that if you have a group that's very homogeneous and you introduce a few people who are different, oftentimes that's not going to get a very positive outcome, because that will tend to create conflict within the group and not generate much of the advantages that are often associated with having a more diverse group. So if the group is a little bit more balanced, and then you increase the diversity, that's more likely to get more positive results. Diversity mindset is another one. This is just sort of the attitudes that people have. The more open and positive their attitudes are about diversity, and the better. Egalitarianism is another thing that's suggested, that sort of more hierarchical social relationships can tend to make diversity less positive. Another thing is that's often cited as an effect modifier, fault lines. And here the idea that fault lines are multiple aligning differences. So if you had, say, a group that was composed of black female nurses in white male physicians, that would be a very major fault line in this group, and fault lines like that would be, according to this hypothesis, something likely to result in conflict within the group and result in diversity not resulting in positive performance. So I'll come back to these towards the end when I think about how some of these might relate to the Indigenous science cluster group. But for now, the main thing is that the conventional wisdom is basically you've got the double-edged sword, you've got the main effect this is supposed to predict, that task-related diversity is more positively associated with performance and demographic diversity, and then you've got a lot of research into these effect modifiers to explain variance. Okay. But not everybody buys into the conventional wisdom. Here's an interesting, somewhat recent paper about this that raises actually some interesting, I think ultimately really raises some interesting questions about how you're measuring performance. So this paper by Deacon and company suggests that, in fact, the conventional wisdom that demographic diversity is less positively associated with group performance than task-related diversity is really due to a bias in a common way of measuring group performance. And so in business and management fields, it's very common for group performance to be measured by subjective assessments. So you have a supervisor who assesses how well the group did, or you might have members of the group assess how well the group did. And the idea is that this can introduce a bias against demographic diversity to the extent that people harbor negative stereotypes against outgroups and are less likely to have negative stereotypes about people who just have different types of knowledge. So in this meta-analysis, what the authors do is they say, okay, let's break down the studies based on whether they use objective or subjective measures, and they find if you just look at the ones with objective measures, this effect that there's a more positive association between task-related diversity and performance than between demographic diversity and performance just disappears. so you take to be pretty significant. That's a defined conventional wisdom. However, when they break things down a little bit further, and they say, okay, but let's look at tasks. Still looking at the ones that are the objective measures of performance, but let's look at tasks that are highly complex and require innovation, which again is another commonly proposed effect modifier, and one for which there's both sort of modeling, sort of agent-based models, as well as some empirical evidence suggests this matters. And so once they break the studies down with this further requirement, then the sort of conventional wisdom sort of reemerges again. You find that task relevant diversity is more positively associated in the demographic diversity with the results. So in the end, I think this doesn't really overturn the conventional wisdom, but what it really does is point out the importance of how you measure the outcomes to what results you get. Okay. So before I go on, I just wanted to pause and think, okay, are there differences, since we're talking about diversity research, not just within science, but in this sort of the broader field that includes business and management, are there differences between these two areas? And are there similarities? One similarity is the double-edged sword comes up a lot, but the most important difference that I've encountered so far, and it's possible there are other differences, but the most important difference that I can really see at this point is that in business and management, these subjective assessments are very, very common. They're very rare in the science of team science literature, where it's almost all bibliographic measures. And these bibliographic measures can really create really different biases. So citation counts, for example, one way to have more citations is to have a sort of broader network of people who know the author team. And if people tend to be more likely to interact with people who are similar to themselves on social lines, like by ethnicity or gender or whatever it is, then a team that's more demographically diverse will have less overlap in their sort of professional network, and hence will have, other things being equal, a broader professional network and can get more citations, regardless of whether the work is of higher quality or not, if that's what citation is supposed to be measuring, right? So another thing is that groups that are more say diverse on ethnic grounds might be more likely to include someone who's famous, because famous people might be more sought after as collaborators, and then it could be the name recognition is driving it. Also important to note that citation can have introduce negative biases. For instance, if you're looking at gender diversity, there's a sort of well-known pattern that women tend to be cited less than men in science, and so that's a potential bias that we wouldn't go with. But notice that even within bibliometrics, say publication counts might introduce different kinds of biases in citations. Okay. So what all that means is that when you interpret this literature, you have to be very careful to look at what the outcome measures and how they're measured. Okay, so that was sort of the conventional wisdom to a large extent. That's the double-edged sword, the effect modifiers, and then some bit of hand-wringing to say about how you're measuring what the outcomes are. What I want to shift to now is looking at explanations, what I was calling the diversity can benefit information elaboration mechanisms and explanations that are really proposing a different kind of way that diversity can really lead to performance. And to sort of get a sense of those, what those things are getting at, here's a quote from this is Scott Page over here, somebody who's very well known in diversity research literature. So he says in this popular book, 2017, called The Diversity Bonus, he says, for diversity to produce a bonus, that is for it to improve group performance, it must be germane to the task. The same logic applies to identity diversity. For women, by virtue of being women, to create immediate diversity bonuses, women's repertoires, their knowledge, information, models, heuristics, representations would have to produce more accurate predictions, creative ideas, better solutions to problems, et cetera, et cetera. So here, this is expressing a basic assumption of the double-edged sword, which is that demographic diversity is going to have a positive impact only if it has some effect on the task-relevant knowledge. So it's who you are affects what you know, and then what you know is going to be relevant to the task. But is this assumption true? And so this is an assumption, and what I'm going to talk about next are a bunch of explanations that suggest that this assumption isn't true. And these assumptions all involve something, these alternative explanations all involve something called information elaboration. As I mentioned before, information elaboration is basically the process by which a diverse array of ideas or knowledge, perspectives, etc., distributed within a group are sort of brought out and integrated into one task. So, one question to ask then is, could demographic diversity or other types of diversity, like identity diversity, could they improve information elaboration, even if who you are isn't related to what you know? So even in cases where, let's say if we're talking about particle physics, and it's not that women have a different idea about particle physics than men do or anything like that, but it maybe increased gender diversity could actually improve particle physics, even if being a woman didn't result in a particularly feminine view of particle physics or anything. Okay, so these DDIE explanations, diversity can benefit information elaboration. So yes, and the interesting thing is it's possible to actually test this. And to see how, if we go back to, this was just a double-edged sword, but with one little change. I'm imagining an intervention that targets this. And the idea is, suppose we could set up, say, an artificial task where the information that would be relevant to this task, we know what it is in this task, and we can give it to people independently of this thing. And then we can have a group that's diverse in this way, and a group that's not diverse in that way, and we can compare them and see, well, how do they do? If the double-edged sword is right, this is the only path that's left. So if you find an association, it should be negative. You might not find any association if your experiment isn't powered enough, but if you find any association, it should be a negative association. The diversity can benefit of information elaboration explanations. So, you can do this experiment and get a positive correlation between these two things. Because diversity can benefit this through paths that don't go through that. And that's the idea. So I'll give you an example of an experiment that does this. The first experiment I'll do is one that described it's not, it doesn't really have anything to do with science. In fact, I don't know of any experiments on this kind of topic that are specifically tied to science. But this is still a pretty interesting experiment. So the idea is, in the experiment, the participants are engaging in an artificial real estate market. This experiment was done in Singapore and in the United States. And there were different ethnic categories that mattered in the two places. And so the idea was you had ethnically homogeneous groups in the two places versus ethnically heterogeneous groups. And all the participants would sort of learn how to use this to buy and sell real estate on this computer program. They would practice that and get some sort of pre-trial assessment. And of course, if people just were totally terrible at it, they wouldn't be an experiment anymore. And then you could get some sort of pre-assessment so you could sort of measure how good people were. And then before they would trade with their other group members, they would sit in a room just like this for a few minutes and be like, okay, you're going to be called in about 10 minutes. And you just sit there. And to them, the participants thought this was just, this was all by design. They sit there and they could see who they were going to trade with. And then they go into a cubicle and they couldn't see anybody after that. Okay? And so they found that the groups that were more diverse were less prone to bubbles, were less likely to sort of have this sort of chain where somebody pays a lot for something. It's like, ooh, oceanfront property in Vancouver, $20 million, sure, I'll pay for that. And other people would sort of follow suit in these kinds of bubbles that would end up smashing where people end up paying way too much for these properties. These were less likely in the heterogeneous groups and the homogeneous groups. And they didn't find any difference in the sort of average ability of members, and moreover, each member was given all the information they would need, so they were all given the same information. It wasn't that some people had different information than other people. And so what they suggested then was that ethnic diversity was valuable, not necessarily because minority traders contributed unique information skills. In other words, it's not because you got demographic diversity linked to the task relevant diversity, because the mere presence changed the tenor of the decision-making among all traders. So this is the idea that can be sometimes called expectation explanations. And here the idea is that seeing that you're in a group that's diverse in some observable way can change people's expectations about the knowledge in the group. I have a little anecdote I always tell that illustrates the opposite kind of thing. When I first was coming to Canada, I lived in Michigan, I had to drive to the border and get my work permit. I went to the Service Canada Centre, and the guy said, oh, you're going to Vancouver? Well, better learn Mandarin because Chinese people are taking over the place. I said, well, actually my wife was from China, so a little bit of Mandarin. So there was this kind of like, oh, I see, fellow white man, we must share my views about being unhappy. Okay, so that's an example where seeing homogeneity, you kind of tendency to assume you're like me in some socially similar way. You must have similar views as me. That can encourage complacency. I don't have to work as hard to prepare what I'm going to present because, well, people agree with me already. They're less likely to call me on it if I make a mistake. I think people are more likely to disagree. Well, then I better do my homework. And I'm going to be ready to expect new ideas because I see people are different. And in addition, there's the idea that people have a preference for conformity and epistemic conformity, this conformity in beliefs among people they perceive to be socially similar. And so just seeing that people are less similar can increase that. So this is two mechanisms which are represented here. One is the cognitive diversity expectation. You think, I see demographic diversity, I expect cognitive diversity in the group, and that can improve information elaboration. I see demographic diversity, that causes less sort of preference for having my beliefs agree with other people's beliefs in the group, and again, that can be positive for information elaboration. A second type of explanation in which demographic diversity helps group performance, but not because who you are is related to what you know, is what we call interaction explanations. And these are the idea that different social categories are sometimes associated with different styles of interacting with people, and different styles of interacting with people can have better or worse effects on information elaboration. But it doesn't depend on the demographics being associated with any sort of task-related knowledge. So here's one type of explanation like this by a researcher named Anita Woolley from Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. And this is based on the idea of collective intelligence, which I won't go into in detail. But the main result that's of interest here is that they compared groups of people on a number of different tasks. So the idea is there would be a bunch of different tasks, and they wanted to find features of groups that would make them do better across a bunch of different tasks. And so the idea would be, whatever those features were, they couldn't be just knowledge about this particular topic. And they also controlled for sort of individual intelligence and also the maximum intelligence in the group. And they wanted to find, are there factors beyond those that predict how well a group is likely to do across a bunch of different tasks? And they found these three things: social sensitivity, equal distribution of speaking turns, and proportion of women in the group. And on closer analysis, they concluded that this effect was mediated by the social sensitivity. And this one wasn't replicated in some of the other studies, so I'll just talk about that one. So again, this is a case where diversity, in this case in terms of gender, according to this hypothesis, can make a difference to social sensitivity, which then can make a difference in information elaboration. Here's a study that's specifically about science, for this team science literature, which is based on a related but not exactly the same idea. So in this paper, John and Troy hypothesized two relationships between gender and citations. Again, this is classic science and team science, really using bibliometrics as your way to measure outcomes. In this study, they predicted that since there is a known tendency for female authors in science to be cited less, that when you had more women in the group, you would, on average, tend to be cited not as much. But they proposed that groups that were led by women would actually be cited more. You might ask, well, why would that be? Isn't that kind of, how could that be? And so it's based on this idea of what they call transformational leadership style. And the idea was that this is a leadership style that's more open to perspectives and more attentive to the needs of team members. And you can see a certain similarity to the social sensitivity there. And they found that these two hypotheses were, this is just one study. I don't know if this has been replicated yet, but I mean, that's kind of interesting. Okay, so here are two hypotheses, two proposed mechanisms. And again, both of these are ways in which diversity along demographic lines could affect group performance, but in ways that don't depend on who you are, affects what you know. So in this case, maybe more gender diversity, more social sensitivity, or perhaps more transformational leadership. And either of these things are hypothesized to improve information elaboration and thereby performance. Okay. So that kind of wraps up my overview of these different explanations. So what I wanted to turn to now is thinking about how this stuff is relevant to the project. I'm a little short on time, so I'll hurry up through this. So the reflection group, as I understood it, sort of has two main tasks. One is to provide the sort of ongoing advice throughout the project, right, about ways in which this project might be improved or things to look out for, and also to create some research projects that can advance knowledge in science and team science or community-based research. And so, starting with the first of these, I think this discussion of the effect modifiers is helpful to think about. So, if you think of this with the positives, I would say if you go through these effect modifiers, clearly the diversity mindset, I think, is very, very much exemplified in this group. So that's like a real big positive. On the other hand, though, there are a number of things that, if you look through things that are in this literature, are sort of commonly flagged as challenges for groups. This group actually has a lot of them. That's not a counsel for despair or anything like that, but these are things to be mindful of. And some of these, I think, this group has already done a number of discussions about these kinds of issues, but there's certainly things to focus on. So one is just the group size, right? So one of the common themes in this research, when groups get too big, they get too varied, that creates problems for cohesion. I mean, that's just like the negative edge of the double-edged sword, right? And so this is clearly a big group with a lot of different subgroups and people with really varied backgrounds, and so the challenges for cohesion are obviously an issue. And this is, Jess has been obviously working on this very diligently, but this is something about fault lines. I think fault lines in this case are really something that could come up in a number of different ways. I think probably the most obvious way, and again, this is something that's been discussed, I think, in some of these meetings we've attended, is that there could be a fault line that looks like non-Indigenous academic versus Indigenous non-academic, right? There could be other fault lines too. I mean, if the group is divided into a reflection group and then a sort of geology group, an archaeology group, then, for example, you might have natural scientists being in the geology group. Humanists are in the reflection group, right? And so again, you get these sort of multiple ways of dividing people in the group that are sort of aligning with each other that could create problems for cohesion. Another one, and I don't recall this one being discussed, is the demographic distribution. So remember, one of the main ideas was we introduced a few quote unquote diverse people into a group that's homogeneous that can create problems. And I haven't taken a census about this, but my impression this group is predominantly white, and the idea is to interact with Indigenous people. And that should be one of these things that's sort of things to look out for. Other things, I think the issue about to what extent is complexity or the tasks involving complexity or necessity of innovation. I don't know enough about the technical details of this particular archaeological and geological projects to comment on the extent to which that's the case. The more that it's the case, the more that diversity is supposed to be good according to the conventional wisdom. I think, though, certainly on the social organization side of this is one that's highly complex, right? Where innovative thinking might be helpful. Another thing is discussion about the outcomes. I mean, that one of the things that really comes out of this literature is that how you measure the outcomes just makes a huge difference to what kind of results you get. And that's something that's likely to be the case here. And there's at least, and again, I'm sure this is something that there have been discussions about, but there's a number of different ways you can measure the outcomes. You could do metrics, how many papers we published, we get cited a lot, grants, I'm sure further down the road those kinds of things will be counted at some point. Subjective assessment by group members or community partners, right? That would be a natural thing. Contributions to this practical decisions, for example, regarding the land and title claims. So obviously these things measure different aspects of performance, but they also introduce different kinds of biases, and it's really important to keep that in mind. That the diversity of research literature really suggests that these things are pay attention to the different biases that these different kinds of outcomes are introduced, and that might result in really different directions from these different kinds of measures. So those are just some things sort of to look out for as the project moves along. In terms of potential research projects, in some ways, I think the challenges themselves suggest research projects. I mean, so we sort of, in some ways, it's a more general question: what are best practices for research involving a kind of collaboration between Indigenous communities and academically diverse researchers? So then there's this question of how to maintain cohesion in a large group, and then these challenges arising from fault lines and demographic distribution. So I think these are, and as far as I'm aware, there just isn't very much in this science and team science literature. And again, I don't know the community-based research literature as well, but not a whole lot about projects like this. I mean, I know there are other projects like this that are out there, and some people have published some things about them. At a conference somewhere, I met somebody who's from University of Georgia who was involved in also a kind of academic Indigenous community partnership kind of project, and written a few things about it. But I think there's quite a lot of opportunity for advancing the science of team science and collaborative community-based research on this topic. And finally, here's just a thought that occurred to me. This is something that arose from talking with Mike Burgess, who's a co-applicant on this project, and of a kind of hypothesis that's just sort of interesting. And I don't just throw this out there so you can tell me what you think of it. This is about something called narrative argumentation. And this is so Mike Burgess, who's the co-applicant on this project. One of his main research project at this point is to do deliberative mini publics, where you get, say, 25 or so people from the general public to learn about and then deliberate on some matter of science policy. For example, it's mainly what they've done is about biobanking, human tissue biobanking in BC. And one of the things that he found from doing this was that Indigenous people, in his experience, would tend to, when they disagree with someone, not to directly confront someone's argument by saying, well, here's your argument is based on this assumption, that assumption is wrong, let me tell you why. But instead to sort of tell a story, where that story would kind of maybe suggest that you could rethink that assumption of your argument. Now, I don't know to what extent this is really true, and I certainly don't want to engage in kind of a centralization of Indigenous people, which I think is a silly thing, since who's Indigenous and who's not. It's just a matter of who's colonizing who at some point of history. But that's an interesting question, right? So the idea was this mode of interaction was very effective for enabling participants to discuss substantive issues, not just avoiding the problem, but discussing them, but at the same time avoiding confrontation. So this is an example of one of these interaction style explanations, right? And Mike's sort of anecdotal experience was that this tended to be associated with Indigenous identity, and that it was an interaction style that also had positive results. So that suggests to me, some fairly interesting research questions. So what is this narrative argumentation style, and what exactly is involved in this? It would be interesting to study that more closely, to look at people who do it and who seem to be good at it, and how exactly do they do it. To what extent is this associated with Indigenous identity? Again, I wouldn't want to essentialize in any way at all Indigenous people do this or anything silly like that. So it seems to be an interesting empirical question to what extent there is such a correlation. How does it affect group performance, and does it benefits it under what circumstances? And if it turned out that you could answer those kinds of questions, well, is it something you could actually teach people? As someone who used to teach logic courses in a philosophy department, it would be kind of interesting to teach people to argue in this kind of way, which would be kind of neat. So that's just a thought. I don't know again how many legs there are to that idea. Okay, so just concluding remarks. So one of the things about this literature is it's really, really mixed. There's lots of different results in pointing in all different directions. I think there are some helpful general sort of explanatory frameworks that you can keep in your head to help you organize all of this disparate results. But it's important to remember that the effect sizes tend to be fairly small in these studies, that they tend to be really variable depending on these effect modifiers and contexts and how the outcomes are measured. So basically don't expect diversity magic, which I think is that naive. But I think for this group, I think the takeaways that you get from this are really to identify interesting social dynamics and challenges that arise for a group like this. And I think moving forward, it could be, for instance, to look into in more detail literature on fault lines, for example, on demographic distribution, and sort of techniques about how to address those kinds of problems. And one way is just to not have them by having when you can control what the distribution of the group is, but if you aren't able to control that, or if you do have a situation where it seems like the fault lines, what you do about it, I think that could be an interesting thing to look into more detail and study these things. So with that, I'll close.
So, shall I?
Sure.
Okay, so questions and comments, yeah.
There's two things that came up. One earlier, one later. I'll start with the later one and then go back to the first one that popped to mind. What you call narrative augmentation.
Argumentation.
Argumentation. This is in one sense, and the avoiding direct critique is a very standard practice, at least in the North Coast, of silence. And I've actually written a little bit about that in People with Saltwater, but it's common. Margie Halpin and Margaret Anderson have a very nice description in their Potlatch Kids in their introductory section, talking about how the debate between what they Bourbeau called old thought and young thought confronted, and certain people exempted them, left, didn't turn up to the feast until they could be brought back. Doesn't mean people don't actually argue vociferously in certain contexts, but the public performative aspect is framed by not saying anything. So people would say, "This, yes, I too have heard this," and go on. And that would be a confirmation. So that's an interesting thing to think about, because I do think that style is useful, and it does fit what I would suggest, irrespective of whether there's a diversity argument or not, just as a theoretical and intellectual principle, trying to actually reorient people's theoretical frameworks with the ground we stand on. And so one of the kind of principles, at least in the traditional way of doing things, is to explain through narrative structure, and by using silence not as a acquiescent agreement, sorry, versus, which is the current mainstream Euro-North American society. If you're silent, you agree. It's only when you speak out. Of course, we know the counter-narrative, the so-called silent majority, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that was just the last thing. But the other thought came earlier on, way back when I sat in on a course with Maggie Benson up at SFU, philosophy of science type stuff, and we read Fox Keller, I forget Fox Keller's first name, a book called Feeling for the Organism, talking about the corn geneticists, and the argument being there, and also with looking at works by Diane Fossey, etc., that gender played a role in seeing things differently in a way that it wasn't necessarily the science was not particularly done differently, but the questions that presented, that they explored, were different, and even the subject matter. So in terms of the non-human primates, choosing different primate groups to study produced different issues about gendered violence than what the men had been doing before, studying the kind of these big, ferocious apes, apparently. I'm not a primatologist. But it just popped in my mind when you were mentioning it earlier about some of these attributes, about how, and then linked to that, though, I was thinking, an awful lot of social science, and even I suspect the science-based teams, are often pretty hierarchical, except at the kind of not information clearinghouse levels. And so that would seem to suggest that the ideas of diversity really are overwhelmed by hierarchical power structures inherent to the units. And that leads me to think that a lot of this, I don't know how much it discusses it, doesn't necessarily talk about even the social locations of the teams. So if there's a lot of work that suggests that publication and citation links are tied more to the placement of the researchers. Their ability to get grants is often positively correlated to the institution is seen to have a reputation to begin with, which control because of who's producing people who go to different places. So these kind of networks that are controlling that whole other side of things, which I don't know. I mean, that's without shifting off. I mean, I like your suggestions. I mean, all this makes, I can hear arguments I've made about the political structure of how UBC should govern itself, replicated in a number of the descriptions, the arguments and the rationales presented, etc. So it's kind of neat. I mean, so anyway, that's a bit of a...
That's right. Well, regarding your first point, I'd be really interested in seeing some of the literature. If you could maybe, I'll email you after the talk or something. If you could send me some links to those, that would be great.
Or like the Fox Keller piece.
Oh, the Fox, that stuff I'm more familiar with. But the first thing you mentioned about the anthropology, that I'm not familiar with. But yeah, so with regard to that stuff, that's definitely, so just a sort of bit more background about this project. So the paper that this is based on, that we're hopefully finishing up this week, is really aimed at a philosophy of science audience. And so I left out the whole part of it that's talking about, and this is important for philosophy of science because, that whole part, I placed that with why this might be relevant to this group instead. But in the philosophy of science debate, the explanations that people focus on are almost entirely these trait-based explanations that are diversity in this trait, like gender or ethnicity or whatever it is, produces some kind of cognitive task relevant diversity, which is what you're describing. And so there's different variations of those. Some of them place an emphasis on power and in this sort of broader social context, which is going to be true of that more feminist, I think, inspired approaches. Others abstract from that, but that's a very common theme. What they tend to not be aware of is that there's this whole literature about how diversity, it's a smaller literature, so it's understandable if they might miss it, but the idea that diversity can affect, including affect positively, performance through other means that don't depend on who you are affects what you know. And that seems to be something that in the philosophical literature is just missed, including the feminist literature. It just really seems to be, it's just all who you are affects what you know, and there's different variations on how that might happen. And so that was one of from the philosophical debate, that's one of the conclusions this is supposed to be making, pointing at that.
Are there others? Because I want to respond to that. We feminists have in fact noted performance, and I've sent you papers on this, but we'll discuss it another time. I think there is a literature in which the arguments are made that specifically with reference to Kuhnian assumptions, that you need to have everybody on the same page doing the same things, focusing on, to be able to make scientific progress, and that the ways in which diversity, demographic and otherwise, experiential background, class-based difference maybe is often crucial, as crucial or more crucial, that affects the way group dynamics operate. So, I would.
Do you think there are these? Sorry, go back up. So let's see. Like these kinds of mechanisms, or these ones I
Yeah,
haven't
I
seen.
think, well, particularly, I mean, we can come back on this another time, it's maybe not so relevant to this group, but particularly people who are interested in, who draw on the epistemic injustice literature, testimonial injustice and hermeneutic injustice. There is certainly a component of task relevant difference that's at work there, but I think it's also a dynamic. There's something about the dynamics of interaction. And I would say also Longino's social cognitive norms are heavily about dynamics. So I think that's not to say there isn't a ton of work to be done, and this empirical literature nobody has dug into the way you have. But when people are citing, for example, a stereotype mobilization, stereotype threat, and the effects that has on performance, and draw that into the philosophy of science, what difference does diversity make? Part of it is that stereotype threat means that you're losing the task relevant expertise of some members, but the other part of it is that it is about the effects of these dynamics on how people can engage. But I wanted to actually.
Oh, but could I
Yeah.
reply? So my reading of this literature you're referring to is that they're talking about this path. That's how I read it. So I read people like Longino. Like in this paper, we have a section about Longino, and so one of her criteria for like objective scientific communities, there has to be these shared standards. And to me, that suggests awareness that sort of too much cognitive diversity can be bad for cohesion. People can't communicate with each other, right? And then the first criterion is about the equality. This one about equality of intellectual authority, right? Which
That's the fourth.
Which I take to be, basically an awareness of this potential pathway. So I mean, to me, these are, and I also find the same thing with the epistemic injustice literature. They're really focused on ways in which this kind of diversity creates problems for this. And I won't listen to people who are different than me, kind of things, right? Yeah, and that's precisely what this pathway is about. This is just like, the group doesn't work well because you don't listen to people who are of this group. I don't listen to those people, and so that makes people angry, and the group doesn't get along well, and stuff like that. And so to me, they're aware of this pathway, but what I don't see is an awareness of nearly as much of the idea that, in addition, you can have diversity having positive effects, for example, because too much cohesion is bad. Right? Too much trust is bad.
Right. Too much cohesion is bad, and diversity can disrupt. Not only bring epistemic content difference, but can disrupt some of those patterns. So I think we just disagree in how we read Longino and some of these others. But on the, I was just gonna say, I've talked to you about this experience working on the maybe ill-fated SAA ethics committee, where the crucial intervention that turned that meeting to a discussion of stewardship away from, you know, the rights and titles of archaeologists was an intervention of Lee Kuan Wiswama, and it took the form of telling a story about Hopi repatriation. And it had exactly the effect that you're describing. So there's, and he later said, you know, conversation, yeah, that, of course I'm not gonna take you guys on, but just, not just because I'm outnumbered, but because that's just not how we do. And so he described Hopi practices very much, a kind of reframing, telling, right? Another context where I've seen this done is in connection with a collection of essays on Chile climate issues, primarily for women. And we invited a Mohawk feminist lawyer to write an introduction. And rather than say, you white girls have missed the boat because you're just right, which was really why the two of us who were editing this thing wanted her to write, she told, gave a narrative about what it was like being, you know, sort of manifestly Indigenous legal scholar, and kind of what kinds of contestations she got from students and colleagues and in the courtroom and so on, that just told it differently and brought sharply into focus what was not well addressed or not addressed at all in the other essays. And there was some contestation in the collective that was doing that project, but this just wasn't a proper introduction. And so my co-editor who had invited her, who was a legal scholar, kind of rallied together an account, and I don't know where this literature came from, but Mohican traditions, oratory traditions, that this was exactly how in a well-developed, sophisticated oratory, First Nations oratory tradition, that's exactly what you would do. So without essentializing, I think there, you know, just for me, those are three examples where that there's exactly the kind of effect you're describing.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting too. I mean, so from an anthropological standpoint too, it's kind of interesting to think about. Yeah, just be a very old-fashioned anthropologist think about from a functional standpoint, right? It kind of makes sense if you have small-scale societies where social cooperation is really important for survival, right? You really want to avoid social conflict, yet at the same time, sometimes it's very important to be able to discuss the pros and cons of an important decision. You don't want to just go off and make a really bad decision because everyone's afraid to point out that that was a really bad thing to do. So in that kind of circumstance, you can imagine that would create a situation where it makes sense to evolve social practices where you can engage substantive issues without producing social conflict. And so
So you
I
could
don't know,
look for
again, that's
evidence
like
for
speculation. I don't know how much merit there is in such a hypothesis.
Kind of linked to this, I've been thinking, so over the last, stretch of my career, I've sat on grant adjudication committees for some, for quite a few times, perhaps more times than one might want to have. But what I was thinking of is how I'd always heard these stories that SSHRC grants, it's always biased. When you don't get them, there's some political axe that somebody's been grinding against you and things like this. And so when I first turned up early on in my career, I ended up on this committee, and I was kind of taken aback at how close our scores were. Across the country, across the French-English divide, across the physical, archaeological, social, cultural, it was almost embarrassingly similar. I mean, there were outliers. I mean, they do that. So I did that for a number of years. I said, so it kind of reassured me. It said, well, at least we've been well socialized. We know our standards well. We shouldn't worry that there's political bias. It's just sadly somebody did a better job than us. And, and then I sat for a number of years, almost the same period of time, on the whole range of different Indigenous grant adjudication panels, and had a completely different experience, where most of the people around the table are Indigenous from some part of the country. Now, just because we're all Indigenous doesn't mean we're all in. Well, that's very true. And there's, some of us will stare at the Cree and think you guys are a bunch of imperialists, keep going forward, and then, joking. Watch it. But the thing is, what I started seeing there is what come up is this kind of leads to the task-related diversity, I suspect, our disciplinary differences became the actual stumbling blocks. Even though we were much more comfortable with each other, shared similar experiences, knew this, we're all that, what seemed to be happening with, if we didn't think about it, is a person came from English, they had a real issue with somebody who needed to buy $100,000 worth of physical equipment. It just seemed wanton waste. The social science had a different thing. People from education, my goodness, I mean, I could go on. And so, so that is intriguing. I don't know how it actually fits to this, but actually thinking of those actual experiences that I've seen, and so perhaps it places the notion of demographic diversity on the one hand creates better group cohesion. In both cases, there is good group cohesion. But it took a number of getting to know each other and working through the differences, and so that the uptake on getting the job done, as it were, was slower in the Indigenous panel. Not that I think that's good, it would take a lot more time doing it. The anthropology one just was like, boom, we all started at the same place, we started going through, and much to our surprise. So, I mean, I don't know how that actually fits, but I was thinking about these dynamics, and it's because part of the idea of putting Indigenous scholars to judge Indigenous things is that we would be therefore more amenable to understanding the diversity of Indigenous scholarship. Or sometimes it was the non-Indigenous scholars who, the outliers as it were, who actually would kind of drag the table. And I actually chaired these committees a number of times too, so I wasn't necessarily a participant in the decision, I was sort of moderating it, and so it was interesting. So I don't know where that fits with this, but it's a kind of, and it's of course these one-off things, of course, it's slanted through my particular coloring of and memories of the event, which I've learned memory is a peculiar thing.
Were the interactions different on those panels?
They were at times, but it's structured by because so much of what always bothers me in both cases, so much of the high level thing is that you have to find who not to fund as opposed to who to fund, and that creates a discursive environment that I think is very poisonous.
So there's a wonderful book with Michelle Lamont, How Professors Think, which is an ethnography of have you read that? A number of grant panels. She aimed at some of them include philosophers, and apparently philosophers are just dire.
I never have a philosopher on your group. That's
Apparently we eat our young. We're known for eating our young.
I
There
heard
are
that-
various algorithms for
Apparently
balancing
you even
out.
throw ashtrays if the Guardian's review of Errol Morris's book is correct.
But she describes these things. That might be an interesting resource there. But I found exactly the same on Ontario Grad Council, for example. We were reviewing from many different disciplines. So there'd be engineers and philosophers and social scientists and nurses and whatever, and we would review all the grad programs in a given field. And pretty much the top ones and the bottom ones, everybody saw the same thing. And then where task relevant expertise made a real difference were the ones, where somebody who kind of knew the field could say, well, here's why you should think about it this way or that way. And I found that fascinating because we didn't have disciplinary coherence at all.
And she just pointed that one of the things that triggers successful panel conversations versus those that sort of fall into acrimony was sort of a collective sense of purpose.
Right.
The groups that kind of had a social interaction where they all felt they were working together to find the best result. Those were the ones that were successful, whereas those that were sort of divisive to begin with, where your personality conflicts or disciplinary conflicts emerged, those are the ones that were difficult to reconcile.
Or maybe fault lines where there are people kind of plumping for, there's a fight within the field and they're pushing for a particular kind of work rather than, but I'm hogging this a little bit, but I really appreciate your reflection on the reflection group implications. Those are absolutely wonderful. And your idea that the challenges themselves suggest the research projects, that list of possible projects that we came up with like 3 or 4 months ago, I think reflect exactly that we want to be documenting what those challenges are and maybe hopefully drawing lessons about how to engage them productively. So if you have ideas like methodologically from this world of research on group performance about how we could do that documentation, getting really to the nitty-gritty, like what. So right now we're writing, Eric and I are writing, and Jess writing detailed notes on the meetings that we go to. But we haven't really had the conversation yet about what else we need to be doing, or what empirically we could be doing as part of this documentation and assessment process.
Yeah. So I would, I mean, one of the things that struck me is that cohesion in this literature meeting, this is something I think it would be good to bring on someone who has specific expertise about sort of social networking, maybe from sociology or something like that. But cohesion is often the study of sort of networks and sort of who's talking to who do you talk to, who are the other people in the group that you tend to interact with or share information with. And creating a network like that of the group would probably be might be one place to start. And so that's one thought that I've had about that. Again, I think that would be, if it were possible to find someone in sociology who does this kind of social networking analysis and stuff like that, that would be, but that seems like one obvious place. You just want to know, so what does it look like? And I mean, my sense is it would look like there's a few nodes of people who talk to almost everybody, and then there are these little clusters, right? So, but that would be.
And we could do it over time, actually, we would get different, I mean.
The goal is to change, it's a work in progress.
Yeah.
And so we're starting off in a particular way that has a lot of fault lines, and the ambition is to transform. There's something where those fault lines have dissipated somewhat, and there's more interaction, and that's really the purpose, is to forge partnership before we do anything. We're trying to do things as we go, but the goal is that the partnership in and of itself is the ambition that will create a different way of working on it, or avenues that are not quite as acceptable without that partnership in place. And the partnership tracks or attempts to overcome a lack of diversity that's already in place, to try and create more diversity. Expectation of that in and of itself will be good.
You know, another, I was thinking, a lot of my application of this comes from kind of community-based politics, which is a different domain than science. But I was, for about a dozen years, was involved in the parent advisory councils and district parent advisory councils here in Vancouver. And the big fault line in Vancouver, it has historically been east-west in terms of, and it's often expressed, and I'm a few years out of date, so these things often shift and change. But that dynamic, and was also involved during a political transition period, where there's a lot of animosity and acrimony at the kind of level of parental involvement in the school levels. And so sitting at the district level, whenever we realized, as soon as we bring everyone together to get 100 reps from all these different things, it just blew up every time. It just blew up. And so we try to think, well, so we actually had to say, so we started talking about how do we respect diversity of perspective. So this notion that these different ideas, so people can feel that they want to participate without being either feeling judged or judging others. And we kind of shifted to a kind of workshop model. So we moved away from the grandstanding event, which often, as political organizers, we often like to do the grandstanding event, where you take control of the meeting, you reshift it to your agenda, and all that. And so we realized since we were in control of the meeting, we didn't want to lose control of the meetings. And one of the ways to do that was to try to shift the power outward and dissipate the possibility for creating a us-them dynamic. And so we did that for a number of years, and it actually really kind of worked. For a period, and each group does things slightly differently. Parent politics are a bizarre thing. I don't know if anyone involved in it. I mean, calling it a community when there's really no inherent communityness amongst parents. The similarity is about kids in the school. We have all kinds of different reasons for doing that. But that seemed, at least in some innate level, figured that there was something happening, that people were coming with different expectations, different actions, doing things differently, wanting different things. And we needed to manage that in some way because we actually had obligations that we had to fulfill. We kind of had to be able to liaise with the school board in a particular way. We had to make the parents feel that from the local levels that they were listened and heard. And that was kind of interesting. We didn't actually articulate it in any particular way, but we kind of shifted the way we had meetings. Some people didn't like it because it's the idea of taking sticky stars and putting them on keywords on a chartboard kind of thing. A lot of people kind of rile, get their hairs raised at the back about that kind of workshopping model. But it actually seemed for a few years to work and at least move through a really contentious period. And so there must be, I mean, I don't have the words, the technical background of the things in this area to know, but we must have been doing something vaguely right. And you know, how it fits with this, I mean, I can see inklings of how it does.
Yeah.
Teachable
So,
process.
yeah, so actually I haven't gone into a lot of detail into the sort of fault line stuff because that was sort of,
Yeah.
for the project of this paper was a little bit off on the side. But I mean, I think for the research cluster and taking some of this and applying to that, then I think that would really be a place to dive in, to look at, you know, literature on, you know, research on techniques for addressing fault lines and different techniques and things like having little, actually the thing you described, I do recall there being some articles about this, having these sort of little side groups where people can talk and then rejoin the other group and things like that. So I mean, those kinds of, you know, that kind of literature would be a place to look and to come up with ideas for.
We were workshopping also sort of promotes organization and ways to create this large and at times unwieldy network in a format that's effective. And it isn't vulnerable to sort of the expectations that the existing hierarchy symmetries are going to replicate themselves, which is one of the things we're trying to avoid. And that as you scale up, you inevitably create hierarchies, the scalar stress. Those are forces that we're trying to contest with to allow for a more lateral, horizontal relationship rather than hierarchical form, although it's possible that we will be successful. I'm really excited about the insight that you brought to sort of how we're doing this. It's sort of ad hoc work in progress, and these kinds of the unpacking of some of the things that we're vulnerable to or that are part of these kinds of conversations is really, really valuable. I like the idea of sort of mapping where we are now and tracking ourselves over time. I think that would be a very exciting sort of effort to see if our effort at approaching a conversation, creating confrontations of asymmetry is actually in some ways successful, and we can perhaps quantify that even. I had a few observations I wanted to make in addition to those. There is a disciplinary kind of division that's going on here. As an aside, I'm very excited that your presentation had largely text-only slides.
No comment.
We've already had the conversation of disciplinary traditions in the way we did information using PowerPoint. But one of the sort of the correlates of this is that in anthropology and in other social sciences, but especially in anthropology, we use sort of an ethnographic model where we have an expectation that the detailed analysis of the small is going to reveal not only patterns of the large, but also provide insight that is absent when you study them at a macro scale, and that there is richness of data that's unobservable to a more overview kind of assessment, and that even in the marginalia of life, there are insights that are powerful. And this ethnographic model, I think, provides us with some analogs to the kinds of things that you've been working on presenting here. Also, that there's an anthropological expectation that the outsider provides a degree of insight, that being uninformed and arriving in the community provides you with a certain opportunity to gain insight, because the things that are less explicit, the less discursive qualities, the rules of engagement, the way the knowledge is constructed, must be learned discursively. So they're brought, it's a mechanism for bringing to the fore the things that are unacknowledged, that nobody really raises for conversation because there's an expectation of logical almost of how knowledge is framed. And so these are some of the qualities that seem to come out as diverse groups coalesce. These are some of the fractional lines of contestation, whether they're from ethnographic or disciplinary or other kinds of background knowledges. In that view, there's also an anthropological tradition of the subaltern as a perspective that provides regional insight. So that within any hierarchy of asymmetry, those that are subjected more to the asymmetrical effects have greater insight into how the system works. Those who benefit from asymmetries are largely ignorant of their benefit. They see a level playing field, and they're just better at the system. When people who are subjected to asymmetries have greater insight into the structural mechanisms of power asymmetry and their entrenchment. And that's another sort of anthropological insight that I think comes out of in these diversity groups, because if you have asymmetries that are inherent in the demography, some of their facet, then different members of the group will have a different range of insight into how the system itself that negotiates people is practiced, and I think that can be a useful sort of framework. So there's the logical frameworks that are kind of addressing these sorts of things that can take on their own, sometimes disciplinary, but also demographic flavor. And there's work by I don't know if you know Joan Giro, you must know Joan's work. And her sort of she wrote a piece a few years ago on sort of the value of uncertainty, and yet it's anathema to many of the sort of scientific.
Honoring ambiguity.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
the idea that it is in the lack of certainty that we see our sometimes our most insightful moments, but those are the very things that are undermined by our ambitions for variance and publications. In other words, where the definitively is seen as being more valued. And so we're sort of in the diversity group. There's different ways of knowing. You have to try and bring scientists and social scientists, Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples together. Respect for those different ways of kind of engaging and finding value in knowledge construction, I think is an important facet of what we're doing. So very much a work in progress, which is really how we kind of launched this project, to sort of throw ourselves in somewhat ad hoc, and in the hopes that something would emerge. I really like that we can study ourselves as we're doing it and be informed by the breadth of experience that literature and scholarship provides for these kinds of engagements, because as Charles well knows, archaeologists have had some success in these kinds of engagements, largely by being ignorant, by simply practicing partnership. I think it's really very valuable to kind of think more insightfully, rather than just be lucky, to be thoughtful. I had to write my thoughts down because my thinking was scattered, so sorry, it came off like a bit of a monologue.
That's just pure standpoint theory.
Yeah.
In some ways, yeah.
Yeah,
Like,
some
you're
alternatives.
influenced
I
by me.
love
Yeah.
No, well, it comes from lots of different places, right? And there's a sociological tradition also about scientism. But I wonder if, from this, it sounds like it would be great to find a sociologist who knows how to do social network analysis and
Yeah.
graphs, and then we could do them at different junctures. Too bad we didn't do it a year ago, but we could as we move forward.
I
But
must say,
ethnography also would give us a different angle.
I have a history of being highly critical of the network analysis. One of my good friends and I, well, good friend. I mean, we had a sparking moment one
Our group
time.
has gotten more diverse.
He had this
Disciplinary.
all these kind of
outlines.
network diagrams, and he eventually left New York to go to somewhere in the middle of Nebraska where they would properly fund his research, so he could study to get these. Anyway, but they're always great. I mean, I remember, what's his name, Mitchell, I think, in anthropology did network analysis way back when in probably the 70s, or even.
Like cognitive schema kind of.
It was anthropology
social
though, but he was
schema.
actually
Yeah.
doing these diagrams. He was trying to create mathematical measures before, of course, they had easy computers. Now they're basically doing the same thing, creating stars and nodes and big radiating lines. I have to confess to never comprehending what those big horrendograms mean when they throw them up in the chart. And I don't even know that the numbers associated with them really.
So we want a qualitative sociologist.
But I do think there is value to seeing.
Yeah.
I mean,
And so, if even if the system itself, even if the tracking of the system at any one time is imperfect, monitoring it over time, maybe
of course, my serious critique was when they were doing these studies in the Innu community in Labrador, what they had done is say, well, look, there's only, like, of this community of 1,000 people, there's only 15 who are out harvesting meat and hunting and distributing it. Therefore, the whole edifice of traditional ecological knowledge and practice is completely a fabrication because all this kind of stuff. And what I was arguing is that, well, yes, that's true. When you take a look at these clusters, you only have 15 people who look at their bringing through, and you have that. Then you have to go beneath that and ask yourself, what's actually going on? So, because they were implying the network described the active choice and agency that people are engaged in making and doing this stuff, and I was suggesting, well, first of all, you have constraints over regulation, who can do this. You have the cost of actually doing it, and then you have the social movement of these things that are flowing through things. So when you actually started watching the flow of the products from these people, those 15 people actually managed to reach out through the meat distribution. It's the only, of course, the only thing they look at is meat distribution. I mean, they could look at other things too. I mean, that says something right there, I think. But it reached out. I mean, and I know just what any North Coast community, you take a look at the active number of harvesters in the community, and you then see there's a small number of people who might be considered to be regular daily harvesters in a kind of professional almost capacity. But when you start tracking the distribution outward, even from the small gifts put in in an envelope sent to somebody, or somebody more likely though, when people are visiting home, they take something down and they spread it out on the network. These things flow out until it becomes almost a kind of a gossamer thread linking people rather than a significant contribution. And their analysis using this device was to actually focus on the material conditions of this.
Mhm.
But it's still,
Yeah, rather than also.
but it's still kind of, I still like, I even though I was critical of it with them and back, I get a kick out of these things, even as I profess my.
We have to be cautious, as you say, about monitoring results. Like what are the metrics that we're thinking of
Yeah.
to sort of illustrate success of innovation, or how are we going to quantify these things, and that our results are going to be influenced by how we define those terms.
And you realize that the new VPRI, they have actually separated research and innovation, because they actually, at the official level, they're, even though they're qualifying this because they get criticism, they're understanding innovation means this kind of realizing of value, often in dollar signs, of research. So, and the innovation side to the whole startup
We
industry.
need to sort of reframe value in
I
a
mean,
non-monetary fashion.
Yeah, which is taking us away off.
Yeah.
But
There's- I was going to say this iQual project that we talked about a little bit, initiated by Lisa, I'm forgetting her last name, Lisa with 2 I's, who's in like public health and adolescent well-being. She's
I think I
involved
know
with
who
3
you mean.
different networks.
Oh, it's right here.
She got pulled together, Dominique and me and a couple of other people in her world who actually do these quality of life survey things, and the idea is to develop a tool specific to the clusters to try to document ways in which being involved in clusters makes a difference to the quality of life, positive or negative, right? One of the clusters she's involved in sounds like it's really agonistic. So it might not be improving people's quality of life much, but the idea is to get something on the table that could capture, so it isn't metrics, I'm suspicious of it, well, anyway. We will all be called to focus groups to help design the questions, what questions are going to be meaningful and get at these dimensions. It would be your measure of, when you listed them, there were, I think bibliometric, subjective, and what was the third? Contribution to decisions. The first 2, or the second one would be sort of what could be partners in projects we're developing, as well as this one is for cluster members. Like the iQual is for those involved with clusters at UBC. We probably want to think about a different kind of survey tool or set of interview protocols to get at what difference it makes, or is more subjective, as you're describing, qualities of the
Well,
partnership formation.
Think about those as we anticipate our fall workshop, because
Yeah.
some of the sort of ideas that you had for kind of diversifying the way people engage over the issues that are relevant to them will inform the structure with which we bring to this conversation. We all do come together in a group. I guess.
Yeah, because we've all seen the examples of I shouldn't say don't really work, but don't work as quite as well. I was in Montreal, like Collinscott has this big partnership grant thing called Cicada, funded by the French Quebec government. But they want it to be participatory and inclusive, but they haven't organization been able to move themselves from the hierarchical, the director of the institute, and the staff, the secretariat that basically make the decisions. And so it creates this kind of interesting thing. It's a very interesting engagement, you have lots of discussion, but there's no real sense that there's anything that your contribution actually shifts or moves into. Of course, I think you want to balance. I remember I did something with Tony Davis many years ago. He was back east and doing a fishery thing, where he tried to make it completely participatory. But you could see he got so frustrated because the body moved, who were there, moved way beyond what he wanted to do. And so it's recognizing that how do you, avoid, I think, those kind of 2 extremes, because it's really important to the sense of people feeling that they're included and engaged, which I think that's really been the feeling here, and also not letting it kind of go out off in a direction that isn't what was intended, because I mean, that kind of right of invention really should merit something for the people who did that.
Or lose focus.
Yeah, but it's interesting because that kind of blended idea, in just some sense, when you bring people into the discussion where they feel that there's some I think it's like clearly defined limits. Helps. And then you play within that circle.
Jess was at the
speaking of
conference that attempted some success. It's just those ideas we're going to try to bring to the fall.
I'm gonna say, speaking of participation, folks, we've been chattering over here, yeah,
Because we had all the coffee.
yeah. And the chocolate muffin, who knew there was chocolate in muffins? It's a category mistake. You must have.
I've been enjoying listening at this point. I think it's been really interesting, but I don't have much.
I just follow on what we were just saying. I was going to say similarly. I think this both bringing this research and bringing this to the reflection group fantastic. It's exciting, but also they had this notion of how do we judge where we are. And there's some interesting ideas of where we go. I found it interesting. One of the three categories is sort of community engagement. Like I think being externally judged would be an important part of our cluster too. We've been judging ourselves, I think, primarily on we have our sort of broader aspirational goals, and then we also have grants, which is our primary sort of metric so far. Can we get our second year funding? Can we get additional project grants that allow us to turn this into research from relationships to research? But I think that other component of having our partners being an active participant in judging how this is actually going, whether we're actually fulfilling our whatever our mandate is. I don't know how we do that exactly at this point, but I think it's something to think about going to the fall too.
It's just a willingness by the Indigenous communities to work with us.
Yeah.
Is a measure of some success. I think that we broached the idea, and now in many cases it's being reciprocated or we're taking our next steps. But the goal will be to sort of find these relationships, and if we're rebuffed, then there is no partnership, and if they're picked up, then we can start exploring that.
Do you mean more so like having them define like back to us or what their perspectives are on the relationships? Like once that's moved ahead past that binary stage, it's working or not working, getting that more quantitative.
I think so.
measure.
It's making sure that that conversation is going in both directions. This is, for instance, like ways we're talking about this morning. It's like that's another tangible thing that was our mark of success. That we are whatever formality level we go to in each nation, and this is the willingness to work with us, and that is suggests a certain kind of success. So, but yeah, I'm even more nuanced or more conversational. But,
I like the idea that we can kind of, as Daniel suggests, take some control over how these results are framed and advocate sort of for what our success how our success might be, I think, maybe, rather than simply defer to either standard metrics or allow others to subjectively assess us. We can position ourselves against standards that we have identified and perhaps some of our maybe community partners that will help our case. I think there's just thinking of sort of the funding, there's an enthusiasm for what we've done, but we do still have to make some kind of effort to conform to expectations that we've been successful in some measure.
Well, and also not only in the partnership forming, but also in like actually the science addressing the questions that were posed by them. So I think that there's multiple steps to this. We had a bunch of great questions from SSHRC that were really cool, but can we actually adequately, from their point of view, address those questions?
Yeah, which is really one of the exciting sort of components of the diversity. We went with the conversation about what we could do, have some capacity, some analytical ideas, and then they came back with some research questions that they were interested in, which were much broader and more complex than any of the specifics that we kind of proposed. And then now we're left to model, well, can we actually provide them with an answer? So the diversity of the conversation challenged us in ways that we probably wouldn't have gone had they not said, this is the kind of question that we're interested in, a much more historically framed, so sort of social question, where we were focused more on specific material analyses that conformed to the kind of data we created. And so now we have to back and see if we can create the methodological sequences based on the sample availability to answer the questions, and we may not.
And that's the fun part.
That's the fun.
That's what we're getting at from this really cool, unique opportunities to develop new methods and approaches without blowing things up, and being able to give things back to communities with information. It's tricky when there are CSI questions that are being posed.
It was just sort of going back to the kind of conversation we were having about the difference in the panels of grant assessment when they work and when they didn't work. There was a real sort of wellspring of enthusiasm I found when the conversation went to the more creative mode is, here's the research, puzzle. So here are the broader questions, how can we do this? And then there was sort of a lot of thought about what we might look like. And there was conversations from us, but also from SSHRC members about the kinds of things that we could do and assemble these methods together to answer these complex questions. There was a long conversation about DNA and whether it would be relevant
I
to our
noticed that
conversation.
in the.
Yeah, so my point was not so much the substance,
Yeah.
but the tone
Yeah.
shifted to a collective, creative kind of, how can we work on this puzzle together and come up with something
Yeah.
that would be valuable? And I noted that at the time, it was quite exciting. And so we had overcome our kind of differences and found cohesion around these sort of ambitious questions. It put us all kind of on a level footing, which is we were all puzzling through. None of us had ready answers, and that made, I think, that made it a more horizontal, less hierarchical conversation.
It's interesting too, like with Musqueam, so we haven't been meeting with members of Musqueam. We've been meeting with archivists and archaeologists who are wonderful. But we didn't go into, well, we went into that meeting and there is the obsidian sourcing project that's of interest possibly, or is of interest to them. But we didn't go into that meeting thinking we'd come away with a question for, a research question for the reflection group. And they're interested actually in history of archaeology, Musqueam archaeology interactions with a focus on UBC that carries the story beyond, further from Susan Roy's book,
Right.
more recently. And so we've been, scrambling around thinking about who, you've written to Susan Roy and we've got a response and we've got in touch with Paige Mybrom, who's interested. And anyway, so we're actually in terms of the cohesiveness of the cluster, we're reaching out to people who were, to some extent, not Susan, but certainly Paige, who were engaged early on but didn't get much involved, who may now get involved precisely because of the questions raised by the communities that we're talking to.
And so we've been
So-
trying to kind of build a model of research that's inverted from the traditional model,
Yeah.
where we're considered having sort of a visionary kind of PI moment with a key question and then going out and finding funding and doing it. We don't know what we're doing, and we've kind of pitched that uncertainty and that need for guidance as one of the key sort of collaborative and cohesive components of what we're trying to do, knowing that there will be questions that we could answer, but trying to find the relevance and value. I suppose value is one of those sorts of things. The other sort of theme that comes out is mentions power, which are, I think, implicit in a lot of these conversations, which is what is in your beginning, this section where you're talking about diversity as a reference against an orthodoxy or against a standard. Those are almost all these divisions of power. And that's something that I think we're attentive to, and perhaps we should be more explicitly attentive to in how we operate, because there are clear asymmetries within our group across the partnership of who has power and where those power lines and the form they take. And I think those will inevitably influence the way the partnership forms, the way diversity and thought leadership and what those outcomes, and who gets to define those outcomes and what their value will be. So we're trying to kind of suppress those asymmetries.
We're starting in a different place by saying, what are you interested in?
Though I would suggest that the power asymmetries, the power lines with First Nations communities in the current moment, and in terms of agreeing or like being interested enough or not disinterested, not too disinterested. Okay, if that makes sense, what I'm saying. And so it's that kind of dynamic. Then there's the more traditional kind of structural power, which exists within the university context, which follows the issues of professorship down to graduate student, interdisciplinary power rankings, which is a different dynamic. And I think oftentimes in the social sciences, the notion of power is that all the power sits in the university, and the power of discourse to go forward and rewrite everybody's worlds. I think if one operates totally with that frame, we'll misunderstand the reality of the political, economic, and discursive power in the First Nations communities that actually really do gatekeep. And it's interesting, there's this kind of interesting dynamic where, because I would suggest most First Nations communities in BC are very adept at negotiating with outside groups. Most of the groups they're dealing with are business, government, and then some types of NGOs. And university researchers are really the weak cousin in that group
Yeah.
of negotiators. And oftentimes our projects are at a second or third level relevance to community. Even though if we listen to our own writings and talking in the university environment, we think we're going to go and change the world for everybody and every community we interact with. And so, but I think that's a kind of interesting, because I don't think a lot of the people looking at collaborative-based research have actually seriously considered that kind of power dynamic. And that's something that's worth thinking about. The reality that in this current context, there's a type of power that sits with the First Nation community in decision-making authority, because of course, and then it's also tied to the political capital on campuses, especially with the new provincial government, because I can tell you, when the new minister was appointed, who was First Nations, by the NDP government, UBC's inner circle started immediately saying, well, no, they misunderstand us, they think we haven't done anything for First Nations issues. We actually have done lots. Let's just put it together in a package they see, so that we care about BC, we're building a better BC. You may have seen some of these stories that popped up, that we do lots of First Nations stuff. It's so evident. So in the context, that's actually, so they reflected, because they realized that they didn't want to be displaced by some underling like SFU, Vic Royal Road, Stumps, and Berkeley. So,
The hierarchy between institutions.
but that also, in an interesting way, shapes the kind of dynamic, so it kind of makes more salient also. Meanwhile, you've got a group over in Faculty of Forest that are really working at the business side of this, ramping up their model where they're trying to offer our real material. So they're trying to latch into the business this aspect of delivery. Anyway, short story. That's something that I think is interesting to look at, to ask how that kind of the complexion it gives
And
to these things.
we're not as, and you've written about this, we're not as forthright about how these power dynamics work in as we engage in our research. And I think it would be very helpful if we were thoughtful. Clearly, our power currency for this project comes in part from the university's sort of realization that working with First Nations is important in the priorities, and they're looking for people who can do that, and so we benefit from that. And our reception at First Nations is often because the stuff we do has implication for rights and titles.
Yes.
I mean, there is a genuine scholarship and there are large interest, but we are relatively immaterial to a lot of communities. But the hook that we might have some conversation that would have a relevance as they speak to other non-native peoples about their rights and titles suddenly gets us in a position and gets us in the door and gives us a certain credential that we wouldn't otherwise.
So in a sense, we become a tactical resource in the First Nations strategic struggle.
What was your code? Were the bees and the
worker bees? That's right.
I like that.
With the worker bees. Speaking of worker bees, we're just a few minutes to 3. Are we meant to?
We don't have to vacate.
Oh, okay.
I
But,
was
yeah.
going to make one comment that
Sure.
I appreciated your presentation a lot, and the idea of bringing in a sociologist was interesting, but sort of made me think about your expertise and clarity on issues of diversity, and is there a way that we could make sure that or encourage or facilitate your involvement with your unique perspective to monitor, understand our diversity, our issues, our fault lines, all of these things? Like, how can we help you be a more cohesive part of our group, perhaps, to like achieve those kinds of goals through our existing expertise?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I guess, so I mean, when I've come to this group so far, I've kind of come to it with the perspective of, I'm a new person here, I have to learn and stuff. So, yeah, I mean, I suppose maybe one approach would be to sort of choose a research project that, like a beginning research project that's reasonably clear and that I would potentially be a part of. So if the idea was, well, we want to have let's look at the first question of the cohesion, and again, this might be, the cohesion of fault lines sort of came up in a number of different ways. One is the sort of academic, and on the one hand, and the Indigenous partners on the other hand. There's also within the science and team science literature, we're mainly just be looking at like the academic. Within that, there's the cohesion question too, right? So, and with the networks, that could be those could be different sides. But in any case, yeah, so I mean, to start with a research project and it's something about the cohesion of the group given the size, right? And then okay, so let's dig in more deeply into some of the relevant literature about this from Science and Team Science, which is a bunch of stuff about how there's studies about what's the optimal size and all this kind of stuff, and start to get so yeah, so to me moving forward, at least what I was hoping to, one thing I was hoping to get out of this is just a research project with, say, subgroup of the cluster that would be in one of these different aspects that we discussed, which would be something where there's some shared interest and some shared ideas, and then just taking steps forward. Like, okay, so what's the general question we want to address? And then let's start. What are some literatures that we can draw on for that? Let's get a sense of where these literatures are at relative to the question we want to answer or want to explore, and then take some initial steps, like this initial thing of mapping who's in this cluster exactly, who talks to who, what's this sort of this initial sort of lay of the land kind of a thing, and then how does that relate to this literature, right? So is this if the literature says, well, teams over a certain size, this tends to be the problem. Teams below this size, yeah, it's good to be, this kind of was one of the things you're talking about. If it's really good to be egalitarian, but when it gets too big, that egalitarian then isn't always going to be the best approach because then it just gets so disorganized and unfocused, right, and so on. And sort of, you see what I'm saying? So just, I think, a sort of relatively focused research project with some subset of the cluster, I think, would be a good place to start. And to me, I feel like there's enough here to have a sense of the questions that we can start asking. Literatures you can start looking at to refine the question and get a sense of where we want to take that.
I think that would be really great. We could talk about, we'll talk on the same exercise, which priorities and which directions would be most.
There's sort of three frameworks right now. There's the endeavor itself, the base group and its subdivisions. There's the Muscular Project, looking at materials analysis by folks from the city, primarily. And then there's the Penelope Project, where we're working with the Penelope to locate missing children in residential school. So those are sort of the three probably most advanced, the two most advanced research projects that the endeavor itself. Any of which would really benefit from this kind of careful study and might serve as a case study for the kind of analysis that we do, which would be helpful, hugely beneficial.
So when you refer to the cluster, are you thinking the UBC cluster? I mean, there are several different networks here, right?
Yeah.
Because each of the in each of the evolving partnerships might be seen as their own network, and subsets of people in the cluster will be interacting with different First Nations groups.
So I think that would be, I think there would be like a map of the academic UBC side, and then there would be, I don't know if there's any people, there's a few people who have been to some of these meetings who are from Quebec, I'm not sure exactly what the relationship is. So, yeah, and then of course the community partner side, and then I expect there's going to be nodes where certain people who are bigger betweens for certain community partners, and maybe other people for certain community partners, and so on. And just having that lay of the land, what is that, is a starting point. And then, then it could be, you could pick something like, well, okay, let's focus on this partnership, and we're interested in this research group in this partnership, and that maybe that's one case study, and we're interested in this question, right, about that partnership, right? And so to me, that would be getting some for the people in the reflection group, or and then we in that process we really need someone who knows how to do this thing, and so we can see if we can recruit an additional person or something like that.
So one of the things we're hoping, I think, to do or to articulate at the fall meeting was what projects actually now we're forming that we might, for example, go get grant funding so we can recruit a postdoc or grad student, pulling other colleagues to work on who have relevant, to figure out what the relevant expertise is. So is this something that you would imagine?
Absolutely, that's basically what I was hoping. What I was hoping for when I got involved this was to be, that there would be some subcluster, so to speak, would coalesce within this reflection group that would be focused on some topic that's related to the kinds of things that
So that would be brilliant, yeah, because the purpose of that, like the early reflection group meeting, we're sort of throwing lots of things against the wall, and the hope is we would see over the year what sticks.
I also think this kind of
And
analysis
this was one of, yeah.
would be really useful to take back to administration.
Yeah.
The DPRI,
Yeah.
I think, is a little bit unsure how to assess us. Most of these clusters are medical research partnerships,
Absolutely.
very heavily science, very commercialized, and so ours is an outlier. And so they don't have
But she did
experience.
mention this at the last board meeting, which she said, just by the way, I mean, it obviously was in her brain. And so I don't know if she'd just been at a meeting or whatever it was, but it was something, I forget exactly what it was being discussed about, but it just was this comment where she mentioned, and it wasn't particularly, but anyway, it's sitting there because they're really looking at how, at the top level, how to do all this, because they, interesting enough, over in computing science, they really don't know about it.
It's like, it would be very helpful to provide them with this kind of guidance about the philosophical literature on how clusters, diversity, and negotiations across diversity form, because that is something that I think they have much expertise with. It would benefit their ability to understand the movement, as well as to evaluate, the success that we may have.
Yeah, and I think that like you're saying, a map would be very helpful just for people in the group. They can say, here's what this thing looks like. And again, I have your experience with some of these when there's just too many connections. It's just like, okay, I can't make any sense of this thing. But if it's something that's
Herendigram?
Herendigram.
yeah, but
Yeah.
something where you can kind of see
hairball.
when it's represented in a way that gives a sense of your other connections. But I mean, so then that is a place.
So when those are developed, are you asking individuals like who have you interacted with and when and?
That's what my thought would be,
That's
like, who do you
yeah.
communicate with? So like,
Right.
someone asked me who you communicate with, so well, I
Yeah.
communicate with Jess, and I really communicate with that's one of the two people that I can communicate with, and then I attend meetings, right, and so like with people that way. And so I mean, that would be
Yeah.
one future thing, one natural thing to start. And so I think if you did that for different people, who you tend to correspond with.
And some of these, when they get going, they'll identify types of interactions, and they'll value create relative sort of weighting in terms of really durable lines, episodic lines. So like types of things. So it might be communication. It might be sitting down, meeting face to face. Just for example, it might be working on something together. And
That's
so
what we want to get.
yeah, and so you see.
We want those lines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I mean, they're kind of neat to see them done, even though.
Are you attending people in Soch or poli sci?
I would have to go
other
look people. I would
Yeah.
have to go look for someone. But I mean,
Yeah.
so I mean, it is certain. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, also, I mean, if this is stuff that we're gonna take like basis of publication, right? You need like is there like a breadth or anything like this?
That's what I mean. So one of the things that we're doing right now is to lay the groundwork for the kinds of research that we might do and then all the components that are.
Yeah.
So it's really about as much about the process as it is about actually conducting the thing and anticipating where we might, what the next step might look like, what would be required to get there.
Yeah, so like at the meeting, if this was a focus, I think the idea would be to say, here's a positive project, and we brainstorm or you say what we would need to do it, and then we figure out how to do it.
Might be useful to do draft out some ideas before the meeting.
Yeah, that's.
Our goal is to
yeah.
circulate a series of sort of succinct documents of what we've done, but also the conversation, whatever form it takes, we're still working on the format will be productive. We're not going to just use them to present, but rather to actually engage with the issue.
Right,
People
so.
can review it beforehand, but not in every meeting, too much, but statements go
Like a
for.
scoping kind of document, yeah, which basically the background is here, it's a matter of, yeah.
We have to wrap up too.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Oh, this is,